Welcome, everyone. I'm Farwa Aamer, and I'm the Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Today, we gather at a critical juncture as the climate crisis unfolds at an alarming pace, far surpassing our previous understanding. Its effects on global freshwater resources are particularly alarming. Nearly 2 billion people currently face water scarcity, a number that is expected to rise as regions confront escalating water stress. This pressing issue is especially pronounced in the Himalayan region, where water insecurity poses a significant threat. Here, the challenges of regional water stress are complicated by geopolitics and historical tensions among key riparian countries. As we approach the end of 2024, a pivotal year for political transitions in the region, it's essential to reflect on the progress made and the multilateral efforts underway to address climate change, water, and sustainable development. I'm thrilled to be joined by two outstanding experts and dear friends today, Susanne Schmeier, Head of Water Governance Department and an Associate Professor of Water Law and Diplomacy at IHE Delft, and Ambika Vishwanath, Co-founder and Director of the Kubernein Initiative. Thank you both for joining me. Together, we will delve into the developments that have shaped the water security discourse over this year and explore the vital steps still needed to advance diplomatic efforts for a more water-secure future of the Himalayan region. So, without further ado, if I could just come to both of you and ask, why must water security be addressed more urgently than ever now, especially in the context of the Himalayas? And what is at stake if we continue to fall behind in addressing this challenge? So, Susanna, if I can begin with you, and then Ambika, over to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Farwa, for the invitation. Water security obviously is an issue around the planet. It's, as you mentioned, people suffering from a limited access to water and to wash more generally, destroyed ecosystems, water quality deteriorating. That's something we see all around the planet. But I always have the impression that specifically when it comes to the Himalayan region, to South Asia, the understanding of people of the water situation there is still limited. When we talk about water scarcity, for example, you mentioned how many people live in water scarcity. It's typically other regions that come to our mind and not so much the Himalayan region as we know it as the water tower of the world. However, if we look at all the countries in the region, no matter whether it's the rivers that flow from the Himalayan to the north, to the south, to the east, or to the west, all the countries do face water challenges at the very local level when it comes to drinking water supply, to sanitation for individual people, but also when it comes to the national level, countries being faced with water crisis. Several places have seen their own day zero in terms of water availability, and that all having effects on the economies, on people's well-being, but potentially also on the political stability of countries. And we see that reflected in the fact that SDG 6 is still, well, by far insufficiently achieved in the region. What I think is particularly interesting for the Himalayan region is that on top of that very complex situation, within the countries, from the community level all the way to the national level, we also have the transboundary dimension. It's 10 big river systems that all originate from the Himalayan mountains, flow into different directions, and all of them are shared between often several countries. And at the same time, we have a very low level of institutionalized cooperation there. So we have a situation where we're facing several water challenges, including those that transcend the boundaries of nation states, but where we have very little instruments to actually address these challenges at the transboundary level.
So much, Susanna. Over to you, Ambika.
Thank you, Farwa, for having me here on this podcast with Susanna. And good to see you again, Susanna. We were together in Bled on a very similar panel just about a couple of months ago. So let me take off from where Susanne stopped, right? We have these 10 big water systems originating in the Himalayan region. As she mentioned, they're going into countries that are sharing all of these water systems, but have very low level of institutional cooperation. And these are also countries that have, at best, some level of what in an IR sense might call term a sense of cold peace, right? There is very little hope for proper formalized institutional water management, integrated water management here. And so that leads to a number of problems, which include conflict and war at a very extreme end. But before one even gets there, what's at stake, right? That's the question you asked. There is everything that Susanne mentioned, from poverty to economic distress. But if we look at them from a water perspective, also I'd add issues like the things, everything that we see, from floods to the melting of glaciers, that seem like, because of rising heat, we have melting of glaciers. It seems like our rivers might be actually have more water than before. So in the short term, there is this assumption that, okay, then we're going to have more water. So where is the water scarcity? But that's not actually a true story. The rising heat that leads to the melting of the glaciers, that might have short-term high levels of water, then leads to extreme floods when you have changing weather patterns, as we saw in Pakistan a couple of years ago, also in parts of India, parts of Himalayas. These higher levels of water levels in the rivers that are overused in terms of infrastructure development, then you see destruction of some of that infrastructure development because they weren't thought through when they were built. They're still not being thought through in many cases when they are being built in many countries across the Himalayan region. And so that leads to infrastructure destruction, which then leads to loss of life. You see villages being destroyed, people being displaced. That leads to then migration, which leads to a different kind of economic distress that you might see in other countries, movement of people. That also then, if you have a changing river system because of sudden influx of water, where the water qualities are different, you see then changing quality of water could lead to a different kind of stress on your agricultural systems. So that leads to then food insecurity, right? So not understanding how our Himalayas are affecting and are affected by some of these issues, in a circular fashion, then we are not really understanding what is the long-term cascading risks that we might have. And so then we're not really prepared we're not resilient enough when we think of all of these issues, right? We think of them in very small pockets. We think of food security, but not really connected to heat and to the melting glaciers. So food insecurity in parts of South Asia is only thought of when there is a drought. But you also have to think of food insecurity that might happen in times of very high rainfall, or your melting glaciers that has resulted of your heat, right? So all of these things are connected, and those, as Susanne very clearly mentioned, we have very limited understanding of that. I would say in many parts of the world, but definitely in South and Central Asia, that are so dependent on the Himalayan region, the Himalayan Hindu Kush. So I'll say the entire broadband base over here, and that understanding, a lot of it is limited because we have very little data to be able to analyze, and whatever data that might exist within these countries is very closely guarded. Yeah, let me
Thank
stop
you.
there.
Thank you very much, both. And a lot, of course, is resonating with the kind of work that we've been doing, and a lot of work that we've done together on this subject, sort of highlighting water insecurity. And part of this effort of doing this conversation today is to make sure that there is enough understanding and awareness being generated about not just the climate change aspect of what's happening in South Asia, but also how we're feeling the change in the water patterns. Too much, too little. In both cases, there is a need to pay a bit more attention. But again, to both of your points, there is great fragmentation. There is limited data sharing. There's limited scientific understanding. So I do want to ask you both about the current state of hydrodiplomacy in the region. We've worked on this and we've discussed this a lot, but I would love for our audience to get a chance to hear from the two of you, of how do you assess hydrodiplomacy in the region, especially given the state of the region currently, with key political transitions that have taken place in this year and sort of the ongoing political and security issues between riparian countries. So over to you both. Susanne, if you'd like to go first, and we can come back to Ambika.
Okay, yeah. Let me start with that concept of water diplomacy, hydrodiplomacy, and what it's about anywhere in the world, in any shared basin in the world, but I think particularly also in South Asia, in the Himalayan region. It's on the one hand about preventing, mitigating conflict that can occur because water resources are shared between countries. So it has a strong conflict prevention dimension that aims at least limiting all the negative consequences that can come with conflict over water resources. But its other dimension, maybe the other side of the same coin, is also the idea of fostering cooperation, of going beyond the absence of conflict, not only getting to a point where we prevent or limit conflict, but where cooperation is actually really happening between countries, and where the shared nature of water resources is turned into something that can generate benefits. And that can be something like transboundary flood forecasting, which is absolutely crucial in the Himalayan region and will be even more so when the rivers actually carry more water some parts of the year in the future due to the glacial melt that Ambika mentioned. But it's also issues of joint or coordinated infrastructure development. It's around basin planning, it's around restoring ecosystems. And coming back to the state of water diplomacy in the Himalayan region, I see it mainly being stuck, if at all, at the conflict prevention and conflict mitigation level. And there is very little happening that's actually moving the countries into real cooperation. And Ambika mentioned it earlier, that is obviously because of the more general relations between the states that are not always the best if you also compare them to other parts of the world. It is also because of there's a lack of treaties, there's a lack of basin organizations. But that has basically led to a situation in which water diplomacy is only seen for its conflict management side. If you look at the Indus, for example, it's very often about managing the conflict between India and Pakistan under the Indus Waters Treaty, but there's very little discussion about actually optimizing river use, maybe looking for what joint benefits could be, how people along the river in all the riparian countries and all the basins could benefit from better water management and not only be protected from the negative effects of conflict. And I think that's where, for me, water diplomacy is at in the Himalayan region. It's falling short of its potential. And I would hope that this might change in the future and that maybe climate change and all the threats that arise from it can be an incentive for countries to cooperate more. But you asked about recent political developments in the region. If I look at increasing nationalism in many countries in the region, and not only in the region, everywhere in the world, basically, questions around unilateral water resources development, nationalist perceptions, populist perceptions, I'm probably not overly optimistic that water diplomacy will really move into that positive benefit generating realm that it could actually be in.
Susanna, I think it's good to be cautiously optimistic, but also be fact-checking ourselves as we go. Ambika.
Yeah, thanks, Farwa. Clearly, this podcast is not going in a very positive direction so far, at least. But I have to unfortunately agree with everything that Susanne is saying. You know, you asked the question about hydrodiplomacy in this region, and I feel like we need a new terminology because diplomacy here indicates then that there is some basic level of conversation between countries. And on the hydro and the water side, I think even that basic conversation between many countries is really missing. And so perhaps we don't say hydro diplomacy anymore, and something else is how we need to look at it. And maybe that might spur the leaders that be to look at it. And you know, I have to agree in that so often in South Asia, especially, but I've worked a lot in South Asia and Central Asia, as you know, and in parts of Africa, on various river basins. we tend to look at it from this big picture perspective. What is it that the heads of state, what is it that the ministers of water or ministers of foreign and security, the ministries, what can they do? And often we forget that, as Susanne mentioned, the hydro diplomacy, if we actually look at it from those little pieces at the community level, at the cross-border level, it might actually serve to offer a whole lot of building blocks that can then be taken to that highest level. And then this is very true, I think, more for South Asia than anything else, because our communities at those borders are still quite connected in some ways. And I'll give a very small example over here. So I'm writing a story right now for the World Bank. They have this Good Neighbors report that they're working on, which looks at community-led developments that might be useful for the neighborhood. And so I'm writing this story that we've done some research on communities on the Nepal side of the rivers and the Indian side, so in Bihar, and how just basic small SMSs between community leaders, use of radio to warn of impending disasters. And so here that radio becomes a really important, because so SMS is great, but tech doesn't always work, especially when you have very extreme weather, but the radio is still working. And how they are being used to warn of impending, either a flood, or if there is a small scale earthquake, or any other related hazard that might be happening. And it's over the years, this has been happening between communities on the Nepal side and on the Indian side of a few of these different rivers. And it has saved thousands of lives over the years. And it's also built a certain amount of trust, right? Now, some of these communities, because of their ancestors, are still connected. But that's not just the case in India and Nepal. It's the case between India and Pakistan. It's the case between India and Bangladesh. And then on the other side, Pakistan and Afghanistan. So how do we use what is existing to build that hydro diplomacy, to build what Susanna was talking about in terms of what we need? If we try to do it only at that high level scale, we're going to remain at where we are right now. In fact, it's probably going to get worse if this trajectory of very extreme nationalism, that I must use all the resources that I have in my country, continues in the vein that it is right now. And we're seeing that whether it comes to the water resource, but also our other resources, anything from food to critical minerals. So how do I use that? But so at that very high level, then it becomes a little bit it becomes very difficult. But at that community level, at that municipal level, at that smaller scale state level, it probably is easier to implement. And then it can be scaled across as well. And so these joint benefits then become really key. The other thing I want to say here is also that there is the assumption that in countries that have very low levels of cooperation otherwise, then hydro diplomacy becomes difficult. And I always give the case of, the Senegal River Basin and a few others, where in the 70s and the 80s, these were all countries, especially in river basins across Africa, that were coming out of decades of colonialism and conflict within themselves. And even though they had much lower levels of cooperation on other aspects, some of these basins actually had very robust water cooperation that has sustained, border conflicts and other aspects. So it's not impossible to do. Global experiences show us that you can put aside your other differences, but work on something else because you see a shared benefit from it. And so I feel like bringing that to fore becomes really key then in this situation. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ambika. So what I'm engaging, and I completely agree with the two of you, the needle has not moved very much from the time, at least, I have been monitoring this. And I have come to acknowledge and realize and understand the term hydrodiplomacy and the diplomatic efforts around shared water resources. Things have not changed a lot within the Himalayan region, particularly. And again, to your point, Ambika, where you said, the collaboration needs to happen at many scales, and we somehow always focus on the top tier, and that's where we get stuck. To which, of course, Susanna's point, which is very important, the idea of just going unilateral and making moves, thinking strategically from only a national interest point of view, can even just politicize the water resources more and more as we go. But there are some so the hope would be that we get to a place we can start working towards the hydrodiplomacy terminology if we are not even there yet. But the discourse can start at some level. And we'll come to other stakeholders soon. But to the idea of what is happening in the region currently, Ambika, I want to get your thoughts on the latest developments that have transpired in the region between important and key riparians. So we have the SCO summit, which saw a rare occasion marking an Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar's visit to Islamabad, first in 10 years. And we also had Prime Minister Modi and President Xi meeting in Kazan in Russia. What does it say about their shared rivers? Because, immediately everyone pays attention to, say, the economic ties, they pay attention to the border and issues around that, but not everyone talks about what will happen to the shared rivers between them. So Indus in the case of Pakistan and India, and Yarlung Tsangpa Brahmaputra in the case of China and India. So Ambika, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Farwa. And I'd like to say that some of these events might lead to opening up of a discussion on these rivers. And I use these words very, very cautiously, but I'm not even sure that it's going to go in that direction. But I am an eternal optimist. I have been working on water and conflict and water and security and diplomacy for what, close to 20 years now. And I do feel like change is possible, right? Which is why all three of us and everyone we know, we do what we do. Look, I think on the SCO summit, just given the optics of this visit, it has, I know, opened up the potential to say, all right, this was the first step. Let's try and reopen certain discussions on, as you mentioned, other aspects, right? So some of it on the economic side, some of it obviously between India and Pakistan, that the stemming of the terrorism and events in Kashmir, those are very key conversations. But there is also some discussion on the back channels to say, all right, let's see what is possible if we were to look at the treaty and where we can go with the treaty together, as opposed to one country saying, oh, let's change it, and the other one saying, oh, let's do this, right? And they're just talking at each other as opposed to with each other. And so that is just the beginnings of that is very, I would say, a very good step. Even if it says, it leads to the commissioners on both sides, excuse me, even if it leads to the commissioners on both sides saying, all right, let's have another discussion this year on the treaty, that in itself, I would say, is a very important step forward. What is it that they will discuss becomes then the key. Are they going to talk about the same things, which is infrastructure development? Then I think 1 year later, we're going to be back at the same step. But if they say along with infrastructure development, maybe we talk a little bit about what Susanne mentioned, like flood forecasting. That I think then becomes another key step forward. Some amount of data sharing on the flood. These are all slightly not so contentious, as opposed to if we are saying data information on water quantity, then that becomes very controversial. So I would watch and wait to see what those conversations are about. And on the India-China side, I don't think that meeting between the two leaders is likely to open up a whole lot of discussion on the shared rivers in the Eastern Himalayas. But it is going to open up, or rather, because of the new agreement on the troops, there is a slight assumption of thawing of relations over there, which then might lead to the ability for researchers, for the academics, for the experts to restart some discussions that have been stalled for the last couple of years between India and China and Bangladesh. Just that itself, I would say, is a good step forward, right? If the Indian experts and the Chinese experts can start talking to each other again, because there is this slight thaw, and that thaw might lead to further thaw in relations. I would say, great, then that's the way to go forward, right? Because just that inability to talk to each other has prevented so much in terms of analysis and then potential projects that could be done together. Yeah, so cautiously optimistic.
Optimistic. It, uh, it is important that we keep a watchful sort of eye on the developments that are taking place on this front, as well, as much as attention is being paid to geopolitics, to see if there is an opening at all. Because again, going back to the point that we made very early on, it is essential for lives, it's essential for livelihoods, it sits at the nexus of food and energy security as well. So there's a lot on that transboundary level. But Susanna, just coming back to you, you've pointed out a couple of things here. Like you mentioned flood water forecasting, just to be able to share that data and share information between riparian countries to help them manage their shared resource better. But you've been in this space for a while, especially from looking at it from a policy integration standpoint. Also, not just South Asia, but fair degree of time spent on Central Asia, also on Middle East, and monitoring other river basins. What do you think are the most significant missed opportunities when it comes to policy integration, regional cooperation, and involvement of other stakeholders and community level involvement in water governance in the region? And where could we do better at all levels, I'd say, national, regional, and local?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think it's a whole complex set of challenges that we're facing there. I think at the local, at the community, inter-community level, there is, as Ambika was also pointing out with the nice example that she gave, there is a lot of interest in working together. There's probably also more trust, or should I maybe say less mistrust, for community leaders to work together. And there are several initiatives, including the ones that Ambika has worked on, that have tried to move this forward. But especially in a region where civil society engagement, at least in some places, is rather limited and only goes up to a certain level. I think the challenge that we're facing is that at the international, so really government to government level, things tend to get stuck. And it's always good to have community engagement. It's always good to work with communities across the border together. But if you want to really move something in the long run, if you want to prevent conflicts in the long run, if you want to involve state institutions, if you want to influence infrastructure development decisions, all these things, the governments have to be on board. That's especially in the countries in the region where the decisions are being taken about 10-year, 15-year plans, infrastructure development plans, but also foreign policy and security decisions. And what's interesting to note there, especially if we take a broader perspective and compare it with other regions in the world, is that the density of cooperation mechanisms, be it treaties, be it less formal ones such as MOUs, or be it basin institutions, is extremely low. South Asia is actually one of the regions in the world, maybe together with the Middle East, where the level of institutionalization of cooperation is the lowest in the world. And the treaties that exist are interestingly also mainly bilateral, even in multilateral basins. It also tells you something about countries' interest to engage in multilateral initiatives. And they're typically very much focused on infrastructure development. So one country, such as India, investing in another country, such as Nepal or Bhutan, in infrastructure that then provides very clear, but also very narrow economic benefits to India, or ideally both countries. Multilateral initiatives are extremely rare. And I think one, if not the main reason behind that, is a lack of an understanding of the benefits of such cooperation at the basin level, joint basin management, in comparison to the perceived the possible benefits of unilateral action. So it seems that among those who take decisions, and that is unfortunately often not the communities with their needs, but the top level leadership in a country, which might also more come from a security and a foreign policy perspective rather than a water, a development, a community perspective, that for them, the benefits of unilateral, very securitized, very politicized, and often short-term nationalist action seems to outweigh the benefits that more long-term water cooperation can bring. And I think that for me is really a missed opportunity, because missing these potential benefits from better managing water resources, developing water infrastructure more efficiently and with less environmental and social benefits, sharing data for protecting communities, for protecting assets, protecting life when it comes to flood forecasting, and the many, many other benefits that can be generated. Forgoing those affects, again, communities, affects economies, but can also lead to new security challenges, instability, was also mentioned by Ambika earlier, migration, fragility, and so on in the future. So we're basically in a situation where countries in the region are to some extent stuck in a rather negative, a rather vicious cycle, where securitization prevents cooperation over water resources, and the fact that cooperation is not happening leads to a situation where there are no benefits of that cooperation visible, which again reinforces unilateral action. And this is a vicious cycle that I think needs to be broken, that the region needs to get out of very, very quickly in light of the challenges that climate change, but also all the other water problems actually bring.
So there is a lack of understanding of what cooperation can bring to the table. And then the lens of competition sort of is the dominant one when it comes to this region, which is something that we need to work against and make sure that cooperation benefits are realized. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the conversation, where we discuss the events of the year that you both have been a part of, as how can we generate better means of cooperation or just the realization of the benefits attached so we can get out of that vicious cycle, Susanne, that you rightly pointed out. But I do want to slightly bring our attention to something that we all are a part of and we've been engaged with is the gender aspect. I'm very happy that, I'm able to have this conversation with two of you leading, women experts in the field, but we've also been a part of the Women in Water Diplomacy Network, which does great work. And we have plenty of our friends all over the world trying to bring attention to not only just the global water crises, but also women's role in that. So it's very important for us to talk about this region here, which is extremely populous, but also has its fair share of cultural, patriarchal biases holding women back. How do we get through this whole, the structural barriers that prevent women from participating in the water policy and water security discourse at all levels? How do we support gender equity and social justice and make sure that it's better integrated into water security strategies and water policies of the governments in the Himalayan region? So we'd love to hear from the two of you a little bit on that, and your thoughts would be very valuable, and especially if you have any recommendations in this regard. Anyone take the floor?
Do you want me to go first?
Go for
Yeah.
it.
Great. Glad we opened up this door, and a shout out to the Women in Water Diplomacy Network that we're all a part of. I think the answer to that is simple but complicated to implement, especially in the region that I work in the countries that I come from. Education, training, capacity building, bringing more women into the space. These are all things we know. We have women in the water as well, engineers, for example, is in South Asia, I think collectively is less than 18% compared to, male water engineers. Can we increase the education on that aspect? Women who work in water in the bureaucracy, whether you're talking about, the ministerial level or even in the community, municipality level, there's hardly any women in that space. Can we increase the capacity over there? But it also begins right at home, right? For a lot of homes that don't have immediate access to water, it's the young girls and the women who are either walking for several kilometers or are waiting for several hours to collect water. So can we change that, where women are not just the collectors and the um, um, collectors of water, where then hours of their time of the day are getting lost to something like this? So then girls are not going to school, women are not going to work, even if they don't necessarily want to or are not able to go to a formalized system of work. It's just work within their homes or within their fields that they're not able to get to. It's also then a hygiene, it becomes a hygiene question. So the one side of it is, preventing that role only be resting on women. But I think the better way of looking at that is access. The minute you increase access to all households, then that in itself becomes an obstacle that is already removed. So in India, we have this scheme of, bringing the piped water to all households, which is for a number of different reasons, but also has a very direct benefit for the girls and the women in those homes. Now, while the scheme, I will say, has a lot of challenges, it does have a lot of promise as well. And we have seen already in many cities and many states across India, where because of that immediate access of water, because you have piped water in somebody's household, that time that the woman is spending has reduced. What do we do then with that time? That doesn't mean we say, okay, now you're not spending 3 hours waiting for water with your bucket, so you do more like housework or you do more like family care work. Maybe some of that's important, yes, but then can we ensure that they are part of the system, the formalized economic system? Because then there are several benefits over there. By bringing more women into the formalized economy system, we have seen that economies can add anywhere from 4 to, I think it was 16% to their GDP. In India, the numbers have been calculated around like 6 to 7%. What a huge economic opportunity that we are losing out on. When women go into STEM education, there is, the tendency to go to certain aspects of STEM. Can we also increase the capacity for water-related education, whether you want to become an engineer or a diplomacy expert or water in IR, water in conflict, whatever? Can we increase some of that capacity? And can we just have more women in all of these discussions at the highest level also? I mean, I know we have all been in situations where we might have been the only woman. I've worked in parts of the Arab world for years where there have been in meetings where literally for days I'm the only woman, right? And that's, I mean, of course, that's changed now in the last like 20 years or so, but not nearly enough. So can we ensure that there is more, so pay it forward in a way? And I would say what is really important is also on research and writing. Can we ensure that there is more research and writing by women? When more women are coded, more women have been sought out for their information, their knowledge. So at all these levels, I think we need to do a whole lot more. Yeah, I mean, hundreds of more potential ways in which we can do this, but I feel like these are some of the key that I'm always like, yeah, let's do this.
And we definitely need also, Susanna, over to you.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think it should be a no-brainer that women who represent half of society should also have an adequate say when it comes to water, no matter whether it's at the very local level or whether it's all the way up at the international, the global, the UN level. I think that's pretty clear, yet we all know that we're not there. We're actually still very far away from it. And sometimes I'm wondering if we're actually moving further away again with conservative turns that at least some societies around the world are taking. I agree with what Ambika has said, that there are various ways to improve women's participation. It's anything from education to giving women voices in academia, in diplomatic forums, but also in occasions like today. I mean, it's amazing that it's 3 women discussing this topic today. So I think that is a sign of progress, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I'm sometimes wondering if the poly crisis that the world is in, all the challenges that we're dealing with, leads to a situation where not only questions of water and the environment and ecosystems tend to drop off the table in light of all these other supposedly more urgent, more important things, but were also questions of gender equity, social justice, and the role of women in all sorts of water and diplomatic issues also tends to drop off the table.
So, I mean, this is great. And I am very happy once again to be in conversation with the two of you here and to be in conversation for more and more women about this. It's just one way to play our part. But I completely agree. The education element, it's extremely important. Beginning at home is extremely important. And how do we make this entire conversation, but also the knowledge around it more accessible for women? And there's loads more to be done, and very little that we can capture in this conversation. But, finally, I do want to come to the events that have taken place. We kind of like alluded to that earlier, but a number of international platforms have been discussing climate change, have been discussing sustainable development, have been discussing water increasingly. Last year, we had the UN Water Conference where we all were present. It was particularly notable. It was focusing solely on water and concluded with over about 700 commitments for action. But what progress has been made since? We've talked from a regional standpoint, we've talked from a local standpoint. But Susanne, you've been actively involved in key forums this year. You were at the World Water Forum in Bali and also the World Water Week in Stockholm. Ambika, you and I have also in our past closely followed the political transitions and in general what is happening in the region, but also things like Climate Week, Summit of the Future, and keeping an eye towards COP29 that's fast approaching. What are your expectations and recommendations? What changes do you hope to see as we step into a new year for a more water secure future for South Asia or the Himalayan region? So, Susanne, why don't you go first and then we'll conclude with Ambika.
Okay. Well, I think these international forums, platforms, whether it's water or broader the sustainability question, like the Summit for the Future, I think they're important mechanisms to call attention to the need for better managing water resources, for transboundary water resources management, for water diplomacy. Especially, I think, for the Himalayan region, where, as we discussed earlier, there might be a need for better understanding why this can be beneficial. At the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that real change happens locally, not necessarily at the local level, but in a certain basin, in a certain region. So I think these international forums are important, but they can only be one input to the discussion that happens in a country at the national level or in a basin or between 2 or more riparians. So I would hope that these forums can sort of trigger a discussion, that people from the various countries of the region might attend these forums, might go home, bring new ideas, bring new discussions, bring awareness to the topic that might shift the discussion in the respective countries, that might bring inputs to better understanding why jointly, cooperatively managing shared water resources might be beneficial. But to what extent that's really happening and what all the other factors are that shape decision-making over shared waters at the national level in individual countries in the Himalayan region, I think is quite difficult to say. And I think that it's very often not so much the formal side of things. Like if you look at the commitments from the UN Water Conference, the 800 something that have been made, I think it's not so much these commitments, where also indeed we have seen very little progress if we look at them, but it's more the informal discussions, the fact that there might be a platform for a discussion, for a track 2 policy or diplomacy engagement, maybe that otherwise would not happen between the countries, that could pave the way. Maybe one more additional point on the non-water events, such as COP, the upcoming climate COP, but also the biodiversity COP that we've just seen. I think there it's also an opportunity to actually link water better to the other topics with which it is related, to which it provides inputs, or by which it is effective: biodiversity, climate, but also energy. And I think here the water sector also needs to do a better job to make these linkages clear, because that might also again be a way to trigger more joint, more cooperative action, if maybe not so much the water people, who might have a very limited say in the national government in the Himalayan countries, but the energy people or the agricultural people, people working on energy and food security, might be the ones telling the top decision-making level that cooperatively acting over shared water resources might be more beneficial for energy and food security than engaging in unilateral action.
Ambika.
Yeah. I mean, 100% what Susanne said, right? In so many of these countries, it's not the water folks that are the most highly connected, but the energy folks. And I feel like we as water people sometimes don't make that connection so clear. I have always argued that if we solve for the water, we can actually solve for almost every other problem. It's not a climate change that we need to solve for, but actually the water that we need to solve for. And then the climate is something that we cannot change the climate, but we can solve for the risks and the issues the challenges that will arise out of that. Same with the energy security, same with the food security, same with the health security, right? It has to start with the water. But how does that begin? What is the connection that I think is always missing? Not always, but it is missing. And I take the case of the UN Water Conference that happened last year. I mean, it happened last year after 47 years. That in itself was, as so many people said, oh, do you go for this every year? And I was like, well, I wasn't around the first time it happened 47 years ago. So no, but there is an assumption that these kinds of conversations happen within the water space. One, I think we need more of them, clearly. But two, I think we need to break open that space. Yes, it's an excellent idea for folks working on water at any level, whether you're at the policy space level or at doing like ground level research, development, academic, wherever you are working on it. It is great for everyone around the world to come together, share ideas, knowledge. But we need to also take that to every other aspect and space. And in that, I think I am a little bit heartened by the fact that some of these big security conferences around the world, whether you see them in Europe, whether you see them in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, they are starting now to discuss water. I've seen it, everywhere from the Munich Security Conference to Risina, to even the Shangri-La Dialogue, to, obviously BLED is, I think, a little bit ahead in some ways, but even some of the others that not such large scale conferences, but a couple of them that have happened in London recently. Not so clued in on what's going on in America, but Farwa, maybe you have some examples over there. But even here, like in Australia, where I am at the moment, they're all maybe not on the main stage, but there is definitely dedicated space for water to be discussed along with security, whether it might be hard security, more traditional forms of security, whether it is food, whether it is energy or climate. And I think that's really good because the audience there is completely different. The challenge then becomes, how do you decode all of this information that we have for that audience that might not always be thinking about this? And I think that is where then we have to really concentrate some of our efforts as water people, is to be able to translate what we know for a variety of audiences. And I think then we are likely to achieve a lot more than we have been in the past. Yeah, and I think the last thing I want to say is that, I mean, I know I've been a little bit not so super positive in this last 45 minutes, but I do feel like the more people are willing to work in water. And I see a lot of, at least from the Indian side, I know a lot of younger folk, especially a lot of women who have studied like political science or IR or economics. They write to me, they want to come and work with Kubernein at my organization, or they just want advice on how they can marry what they have studied to water. And that really for me is really heartening, because I'm like, great, there's more young folks who want to put the knowledge that they have to something like water in various aspects, and then take it forward. And I think that's really promising. And I've seen a lot of them both in India, but I've seen them, especially students when I do lectures in universities in other parts of the world, and they're all like really excited about wanting to get into this space. And so I think that's a great promise for me. I wanted to end on something a little positive.
Thank you both. I mean, it's always good to have optimism and hope. I think that's what gets us going. And water is a resource that we all need for our lives to be sustained with. So we must try and preserve and must try and have a positive attitude towards it as a community, but also as nations and then as regions and globally. But I'm so grateful once again to the two of you for taking out the time. We tried to pack a punch in this conversation, tried to cover many facets, but a lot of issue areas around the subject still remain untouched. And, we hopefully will have another round and go at those. But thank you for laying it all out so well for our audience. And I'm sure everyone who will tune into the conversation will find it informative and fruitful. Thank you once again. And for everyone who is able to connect and will be listening in, thank you for your time. Please stay engaged and stay connected with the Asia Society Policy Institute for more such events, conversations, and thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.